All right, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all had a nice bite to eat next door. I hope you had a chance to check out the poster competition across the hall. I took a peek in there a couple times. Things were buzzing. That was very exciting. I am very excited to announce our next panel. Equity has sort of pervaded all the discussions that we've had so far today, and so this is where we get to really focus on it. So on this panel about decarbonizing while ensuring equity and access, we have Joylette Portlock, who is the Executive Director of Sustainable Pittsburgh. We have Chris Sandvig, who's the Executive Director of Mobilify, Southwestern PA. We have Kim Lucas, who's the Director of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure for the City of Pittsburgh. We have Ngani Ndimbie. She's the Executive Policy Specialist with PennDOT. And we have Valdes. He's the former Executive Director of the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission. And then last but not least, we have Destenie Nock, who's going to be moderating our discussion today. She's a professor in our Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and our Department of Engineering and Public Policy. So thank you all for being here today. Destenie, the stage is yours. One quick announcement that I did not make. Just go ahead and turn on your microphones and you can just leave them on. I should have announced that before previous panels.
Okay, there it is. So, hi everybody, my name is Destenie and my work has spanned the energy and transportation space, trying to integrate equity into decision-making processes. And I'm gonna take a little bit more time to introduce the other people up here on stage with me. So Vincent Valdes has previously served on the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission and has worked on funding end of projects with the U.S. Department of Transportation and as the Executive Director of the SPC. He has led a team of planners, program managers, transportation specialists, and engineers who have worked on creating a common regional vision and implementing programs for the communities of Southwestern Pennsylvania. Then we have Ngani, who she is a Pittsburgh native who is passionate about equitable policies, economic justice, and healthy communities. She is currently a policy specialist at PennDOT, and her work has focused on environmental justice and other parts of how we design new mobility to become more equitable. I'm going to continue with the things I should have said. After this, I will give you each 2 minutes to really give us a position about how you're thinking about mobility equity, right? Then we have Kim Lucas. So Kim serves as the director for the City of Pittsburgh's Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. And as the director of DOMI, Kim oversees transportation investments and policies that support the physical mobility need for the people of Pittsburgh to pursue economic mobility that they aspire to. Prior to this role, Kim was the Sustainable Transportation Branch Manager in the District of the Department of Transportation, Planning and Sustainability Division. Then we have Chris. So Chris is the founder and executive director of Mobilify. Mobilify is the cross-sector community-centric leader that has been missing from our region's transportation transformation efforts. They educate and unite stakeholders who want to reshape the transportation systems to fit the 21st century, correcting missteps of the 20th. By ensuring greater economic mobility, they connect residents in Southwestern Pennsylvania to regional resources, opportunities, and development initiatives. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Joylette, and she is the Executive Director of Sustainable Pittsburgh, a nonprofit working to advance sustainability policies and practices in Southwestern Pennsylvania. Sustainable Pittsburgh regularly works with hundreds of partners in the region, including local governments, nonprofits, and the business community to ensure that our economy is built to last and that our people and our planet thrive. So now I will let each of you give your 2-minute, kind of where you want to start or how we should be thinking about an equitable transportation system and moving equitably. So Vincent, how about we start with you?
Well, thank you very much, Destenie. I think it goes beyond just transportation. I think we have to think about decarbonization and equity in a very holistic way. If you think about how people travel, it's to do things in their lives, it's to get to medical appointments, it's to get to school, and we need to optimize all of our systems in a way that provides those opportunities to people. Decarbonization is a critical piece right now. We know that climate change I'm living in Norfolk right now. Sea level rise is a real thing. We have to worry about community. We have to worry about where people are living, and we have to appeal to them where they are living. It's absolutely necessary. And so I'm very excited to be here today to talk about this with this august panel, and looking forward to questions from the audience.
Great, thanks. Again, I'm Ngani and Ndimbie. I'm really, really thrilled to be on this panel with such wonderful friends and colleagues. When I think about this topic, I think chiefly about taking the opportunity to look beyond the car. And I know that we're in a great room to do that, but especially on a great panel to do that. I think I'm looking forward to the insights that this group always has about how we expand our thoughts about what decarbonization looks like. I also especially think that in this room, I should stress the importance of the more complicated research that needs to be done in order to look at futures that approach decarbonization through the wide range of modes that people have and need, and look at scenarios that approach decarbonization through a multimodal approach.
So yes, it's great to be up here with friends and to be here in front of all of you having this discussion. There are lots of things that I think about more than I would like to lots of the time. But I think what is most important here for me today is something I want to just quickly read here. Electric cars will not save the climate. It is completely wrong. This is not to imply in any way that electric vehicles are worthless. Analysis by the International Council on Clean Transportation argues that EVs are the quickest means to decarbonize. However, EVs are not by themselves in any way going to achieve the goal of net zero by 2050. That is from IEEE Journal. I'm guessing a few of you in the room know what that is. The quote is from Faith Burrell, who is the executive director of the International Energy Agency. I say this because when we talk about this in this space, the question is, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and are we using the right tools to do that? That's what I think about on a daily basis. Is zero tailpipe emission vehicles really how we get there? The answer clearly is no, for a lot of reasons that I hope we get to talk about. But to Vince's point, this is a system that is supporting other systems. And if we are serious about decarbonization, if we're serious about equity, as I understand equity, because we've been using that word a lot today in different panels before this, and equity to me is that everybody has access to dignified, affordable, reliable, convenient, basic mobility to live their life they want to live, then I think we need to think broader than just whether or not we're powering these vehicles with batteries or hydrogen.
Raise your hand if you know what the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure does for the city of Pittsburgh. Oh, okay, good. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, we're the Department of Transportation for the city of Pittsburgh, which means our department's responsible for managing all of the right-of-way assets, 1,000 miles of roadway, almost 150 city-owned bridges, over 800 sets of public steps, 40,000 streetlights, a lot of infrastructure. When I think of energy and I think of equity, our number one goal is safety. Equity is not dying or being more likely to die, just trying to get your basic needs met, going from point A to point B because of where you live, who you are, or how much money you have. When I think of decarbonization, I think of all the things that my panelists up here have already shared, and also how access to basic things like safe sidewalks and being able to get to the bus stop or being able to bike where you need to go, not only is that good for an individual from an economic foundation, it's good from a public health perspective, it's also a way to decarbonize. So with providing those building blocks within the city and expanding access to those basic things, there's a lot of opportunity. But also on the flip side, Chris is right, tailpipe emissions isn't everything, because if the source of that energy is not clean, I've seen more coal since living in Pittsburgh for 4.5 years than my entire life before that combined. And so talking and thinking about the sources of that electricity as well, and especially how the right-of-way might be able to lend itself to either capturing energy or distributing it, is where my department sits.
Great, okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Joylette Portlock, Sustainable Pittsburgh. Happy to be here as well with friends and professionals in the field. So Sustainable Pittsburgh, as was said in the introduction, we work with a lot of different kinds of organizations on a lot of different topics, all related to sustainability, which is a really broad umbrella. We really exist as an organization to help our region navigate the complexities of all of this in a strategic and effective way. And so where transportation sits under that umbrella is really at an intersection with so many of these other topics, as so many of our other panelists have said. I think the word holistic really captures a lot of this. If you're thinking about equitable transportation, you're really thinking about equitable and sustainable community development and how we are doing the things that make it possible for people to have expanded opportunities, be able to thrive, be able to move, be able to really have their communities improve over time. And so I think that's the lens that I'm bringing to this conversation today. And a lot of this has already been said, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time repeating before we get into discussion. But just thinking about transit as certainly as a feature of a community, but also as a shaper of a community in concert with many other factors. And we're at a really exciting time right now to think about how to do multiple things at once to improve communities and improve equity. So I'll stop there.
Sweet. So one of the things that has come up is there are these terms that we're using that can have many different definitions. And I love that Chris called out, like, what does equity really mean, right? And when you think about equity in terms of access, that's one thing of can you even access that technology or other things? Or there's also equity in terms of capability, right? If you do have access, are you capable of actually making use of that? And one thing that we see is that sometimes these definitions also change when you're looking at the certain regional scope, right? If you're looking nationally or locally, right, then the need to achieve equity, whether it be in access or capability, is different. So one thing I would like our panelists to talk about is that there will need to be changes across the US, and there are national and local challenges. Right? And so can you help us kind of get situated with what these challenges are, like, where you see some of those big hurdles, and then how we should think about that moving forward. And I guess we'll start with Vincent.
Oh, well, thank you for coming to me first. I actually do have a couple of ideas on this, and I really kind of want to play off what Joylette and Chris said about alluding to public transportation and what it really means and in terms of equity. Okay, so I worked for the FTA for 20 years, so dyed-in-the-wool transit advocate. I was raised in the Bronx in New York City, raised on subways, raised on buses. But I'm here to tell you that the American zeitgeist, the American culture, is not really open to public transportation the way we need it to be, right? So we need to think about what the art of the possible is with public transportation. Chris is right. Electric cars are not going to save the planet. But even on a good day, public transportation in the United States represents 2% of all trips. 2% of all trips. We're not going to save the United States or the planet on the back of transit either. What this is going to call for is a cultural shift in this country to think about shared use mobility, what public transportation means, what equity means in the context of community, because Chris is right, Joylette is right, my colleagues are right. It's about optimizing community and opportunities for people. It's not about necessarily supporting one mode over another mode or specifically picking technologies that are going to save us. It's not about that. It's about thinking out of the box, how we look at land use, how we look at community, how we look at how people are optimized and have a bite at the apple in this country. That's equity. It is about having equal access, equitable access to all the benefits, all the services that we all come to expect and want. So that's kind of the context that I believe we need to be discussing.
Sure. So lots of challenges every day, all day in this work. And so I could talk for 2 more weeks straight on this, but I'll focus on sort of the straightforward question of access to electric vehicles. So we know that they've become, knowing that they're not the silver bullet and they're not going to solve everything, but localized emissions do still have an impact, especially on communities where they might have had some other land uses impacting the health of their air quality. So if we want to have citywide chargers, and I see folks in the room from the Department of City Planning who are working on this very issue, we need to make sure that we're putting them in the right places. We need to make sure that they're priced appropriately so that they're used by the people who need them when they need them and maybe not monopolized otherwise. We have to make sure that the electrical grid actually can support the potential increase in utilization of electricity. There's a lot that goes into the physical infrastructure side to these programs, and with the, I'm glad I'm hearing the word community coming out of most panelists' mouths, because that's how you make sure that whatever you roll out is done equitably. We just have this conversation behind closed doors and choose for communities what we think they need, we are not going to have an equitable outcome. So often in the history of transportation planning, and especially in things, for example, bike lanes, they have been pointed to as causing displacement in communities. And so constantly balancing what feels like could be beneficial, but making sure that it's responsive to a community and that the people that live in that community can stay in that community after this transition happens so that they can benefit from it. You need to have them at the table with you. So there's a lot of challenges, like I mentioned, to the infrastructure. There's challenges in making sure that you're talking to the right people at the right time. But the good news is that there's a lot of opportunity right now, federal infrastructure investment-wise. The fact that we're having this panel and talking about this might not have been what happened 50 years ago if the same problem we were being faced with. And so we have moved the needle, but we have a lot farther to go.
The panel definitely would have been like all of the dudes who look like me up here at that time too, not people that I look up to and get to work with on a daily basis and get to pick brains and learn from, as well as all of you and the people that I work with in communities. And I think about this on a couple of levels, and I'll start up here about us as a country and what we define as success and what it is that we measure. I don't know if Sean Chen is still in the room or not. But he was talking about needing more data. We absolutely do, and I think we need to decide what it is we are trying to get that data about. So one of the reasons why we have transit the way we do, the macro transit, I'll come to micro in a minute, is that we evaluate our systems based upon how many people get to work, right? And that trip, if I'm not mistaken, everybody up here, correct me, is what, 15 to 20% of your total trips over the course of a year? So the other 80% of your trips that you're taking in the census don't count. That's a huge issue whenever we decide what it is we're trying to do and how we spend billions of dollars, tens of hundreds of billions of dollars each year on this system. How can we move the needle on any of this if we're basing everything on getting to work, not getting to the store, the school, the church, the hospital, your friend's house, the kegger before the game, any of that stuff, right? And so if we don't have that information, we can't really talk about daily life. And on top of that, that's based on commutes, which again are people that are pretty much all like everyone in this room, not that person going to work the third shift or to get you the hot dog at the Steelers game or something like that. And until we are thinking differently about that and have the data, it's really hard, I think, to really change paradigms because we don't even know necessarily if we're making success other than at the local level, which transportation is a very local and very personal discussion. At that local level, in addition to understanding what community needs really are and digging past the slogans and the buzz phrases and the adjectives to find out what those are, we really need to start investing on what things really matter. So one of my big lessons I learned working with the community was how everyone in my world thought they had bad transit. That community did not. But none of them would ride transit. They wouldn't let their kids ride it because they thought it was unsafe. And my ask to them was like, well, you just said you got lots of transit. It's like, oh, yeah, we got great transit, but I'm not going to let my kids ride that. Well, why not? It wasn't as like, is the bus the issue here? And they're like, no, it's getting to and from and waiting for, right? And that's a big thing here, right? So, how we deal with that is really at the DOMI level, at the community level, and uniting around those sorts of things. I think the other thing that's really important here is how housing plays into this. I thought it very interesting on the first panel, the first question asked by someone, that individual said that when they moved here, they had to get a car for the first time in their life and they're in their 40s. And the last question that was asked of that panel said they had moved here from Houston and they love the fact that they don't have to have a car, right? Housing has a lot to do with that. In Pittsburgh, where our transit is that you don't have to live with a car is by and large the more expensive real estate around the transit. And that's pretty much the case around the country, right? So we really need to address these sorts of issues. But, you know, we can have all the money in the world if we don't have these on-level conversations and we're not investing in the capacity of local governments. It's great the city has a Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. They can barely handle these things as it is. Imagine those municipalities where your elected officials do this part-time. Whether or not they want these things is actually irrelevant because they don't have the capabilities to draw these things down. So when I think about equity, it's like, how do we pull all these pieces together? But if anybody's out there on the federal side, please, please, please find a way to capture the data about what we're doing outside of the 9 to 5, which most of us are increasingly not doing anymore.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that you do bring up, Chris, is that, you know, where your house is really, really matters. And I think that Pittsburgh is a very unique city in that it actually started off as a very walkable city. I mean, if you look at how many stairs we have in this city to get between neighborhoods, it's actually very unique. And now, but then, you know, we kind of transitioned into a more like car city where now we have a lot of stairs that go to nowhere. I've been stuck on a couple of those, right? And now we're trying to get back to a more like transit-friendly, walking-friendly type of city. It's actually, I'll give you a small anecdote. I moved here. I have a 2005 Toyota Highlander because my dad works on it for free. And all of my colleagues were like, you're in decarbonization. When are you getting rid of that car? I was like, well, I was taking the bus to work anyways. I missed the bus 3 times. I bought a parking pass. I haven't taken the bus since, right? And I think that that is one of the things of, you know, when I learned that the bus stopped running to my house at like 8:30, and Carnegie Mellon events often go past 8:30, it was, I'm not comfortable walking home through a park in the middle of the night by myself, right? And I think that when we're trying to think about, you know, making cities more walkable, making our city more walkable, sometimes what happens is when you upgrade these communities, when you institute more options in these communities, sometimes you risk displacing people because the housing prices go up, as you mentioned, and then it's more desirable to live there. So Joylette, maybe I'll pass it to you for some comments first there, and then of course open it up to the rest of the panel. But how do we think about simultaneously upgrading the infrastructure in our communities while also trying to make sure that people can maintain their sense of place, their sense of community, and not get displaced?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I want to start actually by calling back to the discussion that was just happening around challenges. I think one of the key challenges that we're facing right now is that there's a certain amount of bravery and innovation even around how this is done. So pointing out that, you know, this would have been done very differently 50 years ago, would have been a different set of folks making decisions, and thinking about what it really takes to have a true community engagement process, I think is really really important to notice that there's a certain amount of bravery and innovation that is a challenge, but one that I think we can embrace to get to better outcomes in terms of stakeholder engagement, which kind of gets at this piece around displacement and making this work for everybody. But I'm also, in thinking about this question, a line pops into my head from, I saw Majora Carter speak years ago. And she said that we should not conflate poverty with culture when we are building things, right? So this isn't so much about how do we make sure that there's, you know, massive amounts of affordable housing and, you know, make sure that people without cars can get transit. But I mean, of course, that's part of it, but it's also about how do we make sure that the community is improving and the lives of the people in the community are improving at the same time as we're building transit options. There's so many things to tag off of in the conversation. I love the conversation about data and getting the right data. I think there's also, it's important about, yes, where your house is. I think what's been interesting to me just in terms of observation, and this is not necessarily statistically true, so I'm just going to put that out there. But in terms of observation, I think that there are some well-connected neighborhoods for maybe 80, 90% of those trips. And then there are other neighborhoods, maybe with lower capacity, that are nailing it for the getting to and from work. You know, that there's not, but the transit isn't necessarily functioning to help people in certain communities thrive in all of the ways. I see nodding by people who do know the statistics on this, so I'm hoping that I'm not too far off in my guess, but definitely follow up with them for the real answers. So I think community engagement is key. I think really thinking about community development in this holistic sense of not just how are we moving people, but where are we moving them to or from. I think there's a conversation about, you know, there's a conversation about workforce development. There's a conversation about housing. There's a conversation about, you know, land use, and this whole decarbonization conversation, which is kind of encompassing all of it, getting its arms around all of it, is a really important umbrella for us to be situating all of these conversations within.
Destenie, if I might add to that, there were a couple of phrases that you used. Conversations and community keeps coming up. And honestly, again, I'm a former federal worker. The feds are not, or were not typically great about talking to community. The key is actually getting a sense of what the community wants, what the community needs, and what it takes to maintain the culture, the real fabric of that given community. Just on Monday, I had the opportunity to talk to a young gentleman who is, I don't know, GS15 or whatever, from Department of Energy in DC. DOE is actually in the process of setting up an Office of Community Engagement for the first time. They're not used to talking to the people out there. They're used to really thinking about technological solutions. They're thinking of applying science research to problems that are community level problems. Finally, they've tumbled to the idea that in order to get equity, in order to really get effective local decarbonization and all the other pieces that we want to see, better mobility for people, better connectivity, again, to the benefits and services of our society, that they have to go to the ground level and understand what people really need and talk to those people. So there's that kind of embedded in there, and it's actually gratifying to see that the feds are finally tumbling to the idea.
I think that's, just to tag in real quick, it's a key point. A lot of the opportunity, a lot of the funding that currently exists has these pieces around equity and community engagement built into it, which is just, it means critical.
I think I'll just really quickly add that this moment is really huge to build in more conversation as we're adding this big investment, because I think in the past, in transportation, especially people who sit in seats like the ones that we're privileged to sit in, would have very little connection to the way that some of the communities who are most in need are traveling, right? Where they're traveling from, where they're traveling to, the quality of that journey. But yet they would see that those same people arrive at the destinations, and that would be the mark of success. People have gotten there, rather than all that has entailed, right? And so I think the tenuousness of our current system is not particularly visible to a lot of people, but the reality is that our car culture keeps a lot of people in a lot of very serious debt, a lot of worries about whether they can afford their car payment, along with the gas and keeping up with maintenance and those types of things. And I think that before, we were just saying these are the number of trips. People seem to be able to achieve work within the system that we've created. And I think that one of the things that I have seen happen, even at the state level, through increased conversation, is that there's more understanding of really what our current system has wrought and the space, the massive space for improving upon the ways in which our current transportation system, our current energy dependence can be improved upon. The vast number of ways that we could really change people's lives by changing our transportation system, the way that the options that people have for getting around.
To Chris's point, we value that which we measure,
Yes.
right? And so the feds for years, again, working at FTA, they measure ridership without really kind of any granularity as to what that means. Am I really being effective in getting people to where they need to get to? I had a friend who was a CEO at a transit agency, he's no longer there, who once said to me in a bar, he said, you know, Vince, the way the feds measure my effectiveness, I'm in the business of taking people from where they don't live to where they don't work. I get paid for moving buses around, not people around. I get paid for being on time with a bus, and it might be on time, it might get to where it needs to get to, but it might have one person on board. And he said, that's the dirty fact of it. He said, we need to change what we're measuring and how effectively we're measuring that in order to get real bang for the buck from those very expensive systems.
So one thing that I feel like keeps coming up is that we're in an unprecedented time of change. Right now, there's a lot of policies that are coming forward to help us decarbonize transportation or rethink our transportation system. So, and I'll start with you, Ngani, for this one. But of course, as always, everybody can chime in. What policies do you think could have the most impact? So if there was a policy to watch, right? Like we're looking at a scoreboard here for our audience, which ones do you think that we should really be paying attention to really see some impact moving forward?
Yeah, I think as a person who's worked a lot in planning, has worked a lot in plans, I would kind of say that I think that policies are best when undergirded by plans that have had a ton of involvement. So either backed by phenomenal goals, they're backed by really, really detailed understanding of community needs and otherwise, right? So I think that when policies are supported by community needs and community efforts, you see really good results. And so when I look, I think when I look at plans that have led to good policies, I think there's really great glimmers. I think the one that is closest to me, because I think it really showed some really important growth in my department, is that at PennDOT, there were EV equity principles or guiding, I think we call them principles, that were created as a part of the beginning of our work with our NEVI plan that led to some really tangible results, including some scoring in our NEVI alternative fuels corridor portion of our spending that gives additional points for stations where you can pay with cash, right? So considering what is the accessibility, who can actually participate in the system, how are we making it so that an unbanked car owner, of which there are many, right, can continue to be an unbanked car owner and be able to access this new system that we're building, and really taking the opportunity to consider how do we make a new system that is actually equally but ideally more accessible than the one that we currently have. And I think that that really spoke to it. I think the other thing too is that also derived from conversation that I really appreciated from my colleagues is that in the EV mobility plan, it really, in a department that we all know has focused a lot on the car, put a specific effort into thinking through the ways that EV charging could be deployed in ways that that encourage mobility solutions that match the land use. So specifically thinking about mobility hubs that encourage car owners to park on the, near the outskirts of the densest part of a city and then take other forms of transit inside, right? And so I think the key thing about really great policies that I've seen be derived in this in this moment from a department that has really focused primarily on the car and is really shifting, it's really come from having more thoughtful conversation about needs, more thoughtful conversation about access, more thoughtful conversation about land use. So I think that, for me, I think the promising policies have been the result of really thoughtful conversation and through increased listening to the needs of communities.
Okay. So a lot of times, though, the conversation about shifting our system to a decarbonized future also comes back to like these cost discussions, right? And I think sometimes it's, as you guys mentioned, right, the easy thing to measure is what gets measured, and then we can lose sight of things. But there are a lot of hidden aspects, right, into who might uptake policies, who might have access to policies. Even though we have a lot of community benefit plans, we have seen that some nonprofits, it's a lot of manpower and hours to write those community benefit plans, especially if you don't have a grant team or your job is not directly connected to getting those grants or in that training. So my question for panelists is, what do you think are some of the hidden things or hidden aspects of policies that might prevent things from actually happening and moving forward? And then how can we, collectively use all the brain power in the room to try to overcome some of those hurdles? I know this is a big question, but Chris, I think I'll start with you on this one, or not, if you want to pass.
Okay.
Glad you started with him.
So from my perspective, I'll talk about cost and then I think also the hidden things here. When you brought this up, I immediately thought of the headline of a Guardian article I saw a couple of weeks ago, quoting a large nonprofit in the Denver area that said the EPA needs to humble itself. And this article was about organizations that are giving money back to the federal government because they don't have the capacity to work within the framework that the federal government is putting on nonprofit actors to do the things that the IRA and IIJA money is supposed to be doing. And there was also another article in Bloomberg about a tower downtown that was trying to use a loan program that I think DOT put together that encouraged transit development, and the time to close on that, I'm sure I'm not saying that right because I'm not a developer, was 18 to 24 months on a project that they need to like cash flow now because their vacancy rate is really freaking low. And this was housing in our urban core, right? So that's some of the unintended consequences here, I think. I think one of the other unintended consequences, and the nonprofit industrial complex is just as guilty of this as anybody else is sort of what the siloing actually brings. So in IIJA, for example, we've been watching how a lot of the discretionary money has been spent, and it has been encouraging those who are submitting projects that are more comprehensive in what they're trying to accomplish, not just fixing a bridge, not just refurbing a bus stop, but what is that actually tied to in terms of community benefit? I think we need to have more of those conversations of like, okay, with what we have, and I'm not saying that this is an austerity thing, I think it's the opposite. Like, let's stop calling this alternative transportation, because it wasn't the alternative until 1955, 1956. And so we need to bring that back. And here's the little dirty secret about these billions and billions of dollars of money. You can build the facilities for the walking, the biking, the macro transit, the micro transit, as it's already written within the federal register. And we talk about, PennDOT itself will say how they don't have the money to draw down all these federal dollars. Would their projects be more competitive for these federal dollars if they incorporated these aspects of it in their existing projects, as opposed to just more lane miles, right? And so I think from my perspective, back to the data pieces, how do we get more holistic about this? And how do we also break down some of the things within our own culture about this whole thing about the next new thing in transportation fixes all the things that the last several thousand things broke? And let's talk about how we're moving someone from where they live to where they work, not about the bus, not about the minibus, not about the scooter, not about the bike, not about the car. How are we making that trip better and more affordable for folks and more rewarding? I think if we start from that point, how the policies fall out will be completely different.
The most decarbonized trip is the trip not taken. If you can create 15-minute neighborhoods where you can get to a grocery store, you can get to a doctor's appointment, you can do all the things you want to do within 15 or 20 minutes walking from your home, that's a land use question. That's not really a transportation question. And that's a hard tack for our culture, for our country.
Although I think that, there are places that are doing a good job of marrying those two, right? We have fewer levers. I'm going to say it. We have fewer levers than Massachusetts. It's very state. The state has a lot of power. The municipalities have less power, but they've done a phenomenal job of saying, hey, if you're a municipality that has a transit stop, you need to build housing here. They really have said, this transportation land use thing, we're not making these separate problems. We're not making these separate worlds. They are the same world. And the way that it impacts, our communities are really significant. And so there are slight ways that hopefully together we'll be able to move in Pennsylvania towards that. But, I think those problems are so near and really, narrowing those distances is really key and is one of the challenges that we have. I think that especially as, there's a lot of students of public policy and engineering public policy here. I think that's really what's coming. One of the things that's really coming for us to work on.
These people stole my thunder.
Oh.
That's the problem with being with all these transportation experts on the same stage. So maybe I'll focus on the question of what can the people in this room and in this space do to help us? So you heard me list off all the infrastructure that my department's responsible for, in addition to issuing more permits than any other department, managing the majority of the city's capital dollars, and also doing all the mobility planning in conjunction, of course, with our partners at City Planning and SPC and PennDOT. It's a lot of stuff. How many people do we think is in this room right now? 115, 150, 50? My whole department could fit in this room. So think about that. All of those functions, every single permit and inspection in the right-of-way in the city, 1,000 miles of roadway worth of right-of-way. My whole department can fit in this room. So back to, I think Chris mentioned capacity building challenges. Not only are there real money shortages, all of this federal money, there's trillions of federal dollars available, but most of that comes with requiring some amount of match money from the local government, so 20%. Sometimes that goes down to 0% for Pittsburgh. A lot of our bridges are 100% funded outside the city right now, which is amazing. So we don't have a lot of the dollars to go after some of those opportunities, and we don't have the human beings. We are people who have been doing this work for a long time, and there's been a lot of change in this space over the last 5 years, even 10 years. And so for the smart folks in this room, partnering with us, coming to work for us, even though I've never heard the nonprofit industrial complex term before today, I feel that. But also working within organizations like that then come and help out the city. I'll give one note. Someone already mentioned about giving money back to the federal government. Many years ago, when I was doing my master's professional report, which is like a thesis, I thought, wow, more transit systems would use non-diesel buses if they knew how to integrate non-diesel buses into their fleet. Like, that must be the problem. Nobody's using all this federal money to get hybrid or hydrogen because they don't know how to do it. So I will talk to people who have done it. I'll write a manual on it, and that'll be great. That'll be a game changer, a cookbook. So what I learned, though, when I was talking to people who were using hydrogen buses or using hybrid buses or fully electric buses, is that the motivation for each of those places to do it was very different, which I was surprised by. I thought it was, we care about the environment and there's money for it, let's do it. In fact, the actual reasons were there's a hydrogen company locally, and so I'm leasing my buses for $1 a year, or some other thing that had nothing to do with what I thought they were going to say. And I did talk to people who gave money back because the integration was too hard. So even though it seems like, and it is a really amazing time right now, a lot of money, a lot of motivation for equity, community engagement, environment, that doesn't mean we can use it. That doesn't mean there aren't these real barriers. And the barriers, a little bit, is the capacity, the human beings, the brains to help us think through how to implement. And then time. You know, I heard the 18 to 24 months. It's no surprise. We had a bridge collapse in the city of Pittsburgh on January 28th, a couple years ago. That year, we went after bridge improvement money. We did not get the grant. The president was literally in our city the day a bridge collapsed, and we did not get the federal money for bridge investments that we needed because of some of the parameters of the program. We didn't have a bridge that had already been designed that was ready to go that we could then spend the money in the time frame that the feds put on it. And so there are these like sort of paperworky, wonky challenges that are in the way of us being able, and I know the point is we need to iterate, we need to move faster, we need to learn new ways of doing things. But if we're going to miss all the opportunities because we haven't iterated or figured out how to move fast, then we're not going to be anywhere new in the next 5 to 10 years.
I love that. I love that because I think to what I said earlier about this being a moment for innovation and bravery, right? It takes that iteration. And so this conversation is really important because if you don't point out how our first experiment didn't work real well and we maybe need to think about, you know, how to redesign, then we don't get there. We need to hold that space open. And in response to the question about hidden costs, I just want to, you know, make sure that the health framing is part of this conversation too, right? And we've got a lot of costs, and we talk about decarbonization broadly and transportation specifically, where the costs in terms of health are borne by individuals rather than by systems or by producers. And so there's an opportunity here to think about how to incorporate that consideration into our solutions as we're building them. A lot of EJ communities are the result of massive amounts of pollution of our current systems impacting people's health.
I'd like to bring it back to energy for a second here and on the policy side and the project side of things on something I got the opportunity to put together for a conference I'm part of in Massachusetts, where there's a commuter line that they are looking to electrify. It's right now a diesel commuter line. And the equity piece to this is because of it being electrified, these EJ communities now have better quality air. But in addition to that, it's actually reasonable to build affordable housing along this commuter line because the headways of this train line can be shorter because of the fact the train is electric. So there's actually opportunity for more service as a consequence of this. But that's the layering that we're talking about here. And I think that's the policy piece that is like, what else are you impacting here and bringing along in it? So.
I do want to quickly also shout out, City of Pittsburgh has done a really good job of taking advantage of state incentives for electrifying its fleet, especially some of its kind of mid and larger size vehicles that really do provide services in all of our city neighborhoods. So in terms of, the City of Pittsburgh kind of leading by example, understanding, its local air quality impacts, I think that those are some, that type of fleet electrification, especially in places that already have bad air quality, is the type of thing that we know makes a big impact. And so I think we know that we have to take advantage, take a moment to look at the not even that small wins, but I do think that the City of Pittsburgh leading by example with especially the size of vehicle, they're electrifying vehicles that have to be used, right? It's not like it's a vehicle that could, a bike trip could use instead. It's like these larger vehicles for other purposes. And it's been a really great thing to see. An anecdote I'll say is I was standing outside of my house with someone who was to do some work on it. And the way, the massive double take this person did for one of the city's electric F-150s was just a sight to see. They were like they were just so enthralled by getting to see this exciting technology. So I think it's been a really nice thing. It's also been something that has brought other people into the conversation, brought other people into seeing the viability of this technology, especially for people who need vehicles of those sizes for those purposes.
Sweet. So one thing that I think would be nice is if there are any burning questions in the audience. We have Daniel, our mic runner. We have one in the middle. Daniel, keep raising your hands.
Well, just as per tradition, I wanted to make sure that we got to our students for the first question. So if there are any students in the room that have a question, I'm happy to run this mic over to you.
While
Wait,
he's
we
walking.
have one in the back. Perfect.
While he, oh.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I had a slightly higher level question when it comes to transport. I wanted to talk about trains and flights, if that's okay. There's a growing trend in Europe currently whereby short haul, some countries are experimenting with banning certain short haul domestic journeys that have an alternative journey by train that could be done in under 3 hours. So the analogy in the US would be if New York, Boston could be done within a 3-hour train, fast train, then all New York, Boston flights would be banned. This is what some countries are trying to experiment. It's obviously, I don't think, not too much of a serious topic of conversation yet in the US. What do you think would it take for the US to start to look at an aggressive, let's say, policy like this?
For the US to take passenger rail seriously and actually invest in it. Because if you are going to take away that plane trip, you better have something ready to go that people know they can rely on and not have to wait until tomorrow to take the next train if they missed that one, which is what we have right now. I don't know if anybody, show of hands, who knew that we got a bunch of federal money to get a second train to Philadelphia? Okay, that's more than I expected, but that's still far less than half.
My people.
Right? So that project is supposed to be done, I think, by 2027, is that right? I think. Yeah. Okay, so here's the dirty little secret. The advocacy that led to that took 10 years to get to it, and a recalcitrant Department of Transportation that people had to file a Freedom of Information Request Act with Republican Senator Pat Toomey to get the rail plan released in order to actually have a conversation about this. And if it takes that kind of approach just to get a second train, nothing about like making it faster, just a second train. How are we ever going to be able to do that in the United States? I think also just on the Wonk side for a minute, let's also recognize like transcontinental rail, yeah, that's never going to win out over a plane. But, and I don't think it necessarily does in Europe in a lot of cases either. But if we don't have that investment on the other side in these sorts of things, then forget it. Everything just falls apart. It is a system of systems. You pull on one piece, something else reacts. And we have to be ready for that.
I think in the United States we do well. Well, one, I think that in your example, I think that that's in a way a reasonable policy because there's that time bounding. We don't have a lot of lines that would match that, right? That under 3 hours. That's not Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. That's not, Pittsburgh to DC. That we have not great train service here, but it exists and I ride it. So I will say though that where it would work, it'd probably be the Acela line. I think policy-wise, what tends to work here in the States is pricing things. So if, in a policy that sort of made it so that it was expensive for the airline to run it or expensive for that then they had to pass it to the customer, I think tends to be the type of way that we end up doing things. We put a price on things, but it would apply to so few like routes that exist. But I think it's an admirable idea.
Well, I've got opinions, typically. The train, have you heard of SAPRC? Have you all heard of SAPRC, the State Amtrak Intercity Passenger Rail? So there's this little tiny entity, some like quasi-governmental that Congress is requiring to exist that is like, its job is to make sure that states who have funding for rail and Amtrak play nice together because a lot of Amtrak service is actually funded through the states, is my understanding. And so I think that there's hope, and there is hope, Chris, there's hope.
I know.
But we are far away.
I'm just doing real talk, sorry.
Well, the thing about Pittsburgh is I've taken Greyhound more times than I've taken the train from here to DC. And spoiler alert, on my first trip on Greyhound, long story, I woke up with a mouse on my face, okay? Truly, like, and I still took Greyhound again after that because it was a better option than waiting for the one train a day to DC, and I didn't have 8 hours. Yeah, I'll tell that story later. But it's one of my favorites, actually. I was really impressed. The bus was nice. It was clean. It was leather. There was only one pit bull on there. The bus station downtown was actually quite nice compared to the Amtrak station downtown, I believe. But anyway, so say proceed, point being there's investment and there's attention. I've also heard at the federal level that there is a real focus on safety for rail in general right now. That's like the #1 safety concern. I mean, people are dying on our streets every day, but also not too far from here, we had a derailment that had huge consequences for the environment and folks. So I think there is interest there, but in Pittsburgh especially, I feel like it's water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink, because there are so many rail lines. In my job, we have to interface with all these different freight carriers. And they have a lot of protections at the federal level. So back to the policy thing, like if there's some way to break down that like railroad baron situation from hundreds of years ago that we still deal with now with interacting with them, maybe there'd be more collaboration and the ability to have better connectivity.
I want to be careful. It's not that all is lost, sorry, but there's actually something else in the infrastructure law about interstate passenger rail compacts. One of the things that I'm actually interested in is figuring how we start one here in Pennsylvania. Because there are actually places, DC notwithstanding, that we can do this with in our area, and there are mechanisms for it and people who want to do this. But it is a big mountain to climb in the United States.
So we have time for one more question before I'll ask our panel to leave us with their final thought-provoking sentence or two.
So my question's in a bigger picture. When we look at Pittsburgh and Bigelow and what the forward-looking plans that happened here, when you look at places like 228, where they reserved stuff 60 years ago, so when expansion happened, when they built the New York's, the sewer system, they did it 4 times the size, looking into the future. Today, with all the holistic approaches Chris talked about, who is in charge of looking down the road and saying, where do we want to be 60 years from now at the local level, at the state level? And are you sitting there together and saying, where do we start? This is the crystal ball. And maybe today we don't have a Facebook page called Death Stares that features Pittsburgh all the time. And maybe and that's not being critical of you. I'm just saying, what are the things that we can do to improve, maybe that are small things that fit into that larger picture? So to your point, Chris, that we're not spending money on things that we're then talking about fixing because we didn't fix them right the first time. Who's doing that?
Do we really know? I guess, yeah, I think the thing is, like, do we really know, right? And I'm going to just stall here so my panel has time to think about that really thought-provoking question, but I will say that one of the things that has kept coming up from my panelists is that we need to integrate more and more people into the discussion. And so a lot of times, the challenge is the tragedy of the commons, right? When we want a lot of people to start thinking about this, if we need one person to really think about this, right? But we don't want that one person to be the only person thinking about this because we need a lot of people to think about this. So maybe I've stalled.
Do we want Robert Moses again? I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, we have a metropolitan planning organization, and as a person with a transportation planning degree, I think planning organization, like that's the point of planning. But it does happen at multiple levels, and I think, does SPC get the credit for that slide that was shown in the Pittsburgh Downtown Partnerships planning process a couple years ago, or maybe it was PRT's planning process? Point being, there's plans at all these different levels, and making like a Russian egg doll thing. Russian doll. Nesting dolls. Yes, sorry. I hope that wasn't offensive. I apologize. But the idea is that we're all doing it, and we have to make sure we're talking. And so the fact that we know each other is a good thing. The fact that each of us had met each other before this conversation today is a great thing, because it means we're starting to get to that vision. But just to brag about Pittsburgh and DOMI, we at DOMI do have a 50-year vision plan, 2070. And so we did take the time to think about the next 50 years in the city of Pittsburgh and where are the connections that need to be made all the way from neighborhood to neighborhood to Pittsburgh to the globe. That is the big thinking. The Department of City Planning is kicking off, I think, the first comprehensive plan that the city of Pittsburgh has had ever, or if not ever, then in hundreds of years or something. So it's happening, but you're right that I think it could happen more, and making sure that at each level we're talking is really critical.
Yeah, I want to be careful that like the big things, to say that the big things should happen. I'm not saying they shouldn't happen. I think we need to take a different approach to how we come up with those big things and who is the one who's deciding what the big things are. I am a big supporter of the Bus Rapid Transit Project. I'm also a supporter of the North Shore Connector. I know that when both of those started, especially North Shore Connector, there was not an institution elected official in this town, Republican nor Democrat, who was against that. And when it was done, there was not an elected official or institution in this town that was for it, right? And it was not part of a broader strategy, right? And that's the piece I think that's missing here. But what I also find in my work is whenever we have these big things, those of us who are trying to help communities and get the things that they need and want, don't get to talk about those as part of that project. It consumes all the oxygen in the room. We're not allowed to talk about anything else whenever we're going after a bus rapid transit grant, for example. And that can't happen. We have to have the big and the small living alongside each other so we don't have another Robert Moses situation. And the vision needs to be able to live beyond an elected official, needs to live beyond a funding cycle, needs to live beyond a director cycle. And I'm all for that, but I think, there's pieces we have to bring into this as we're doing that.
So Joylette, I'll let you talk last on this question, and then we have to go into the last thing that each of you wants us to leave with. So
Sounds good. I was just going to affirm the last part of what Chris was saying, that we aren't super great people just in general at thinking on those kinds of timescales and planning on those kinds of timescales. I think it has to be an very intentional effort, and it's thwarted often by funding cycles, by immediate needs, by kind of the opportunism of the moment in which we find ourselves, as well as the fragmented pieces of efforts that are happening all around, which our region is well known for. So in answer to the question about who is doing that, there's a reason that everyone on this panel kind of looked at each other and kind of blankly thought about it for a minute, because I think that's an area for improvement for us. And it's great to hear about the work that Domi is doing. I think we need, more planning that takes future trends really into consideration, in addition to kind of looking back and understanding the incredible and convoluted and complicated and contradictory history and implementation of transportation and transit in any place, but in this place. We need to look forward clear-eyed and understanding that, when it comes to climate, when it comes to community, when it comes to a lot of different factors, the future is not going to look necessarily like our most recent past. And we need to be thoughtful about that in our planning process out beyond the next funding cycle as well. So,
okay, so you guys get one sentence because I got the signal. So,
I guess if I'm going to leave you with anything, it's about holistic thinking. It's about community engagement, and it's certainly not about applying a technology or looking for technology in search of a problem. That's never going to solve it.
I'm going to echo it. I think that, it's not about the car. It's not about the bike. You heard it here. It's not about the bike. It's about what it does for the community, right? What access does it provide at what price point and whatever else? So just think about the community, think about the needs as we plan for decarbonization, as we plan for the future vibrancy of our communities and regions, states.
We need to rethink success. We need better data for that, ride bikes, take transit, period.
Technology won't solve this. It's going to be more than that.
we really need to be thinking about systems, all of the systems, and how they interact with all of the people to create the solutions that will work.
All right, so please join me in thanking our panel.